So now that we learn about interfaces, about abstract, about polymorphism, let's go ahead and modify this button a little bit. Right now, when the button gets clicked, it needs to know about a method named action performed. It has to have that name. So the way to enforce this is they have this class, in this case an interface, called Actionlistener, which forces any class that implements Actionlistener to have this method inside. Now, right now, what we've done is we created something called an anonymous class. So this anonymous object has no reference to it other than this submit name button, which is not ours. So there's no way for me to call this method again. So if I have more than one button, I have to create this multiple times. However, there's one thing we could do. Actually, before we do anything, let's just run it to see how it looks like, just so I could remember. Doop, 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 doop. So there we go. Let's go back. So we have two buttons, and in this case, this button is for the submit name, the button down here. But we have two other buttons that if we wanted to do something, we have to again do an add action listener and add it in there. So let's go see which those two buttons are. Left side button 2 and left side button 1. So if I wanted to do again an event for it when it gets clicked, I will go and say left side button, add action listener, new action listener, and I would put whatever I need to do here. Left side button clicked, right? And the same thing will go for the second button. Let's go ahead and copy that and put 2 in there, put 2 in there. So you could see all three buttons have an action listener. And this becomes a lot of excessive code and so forth, so on. And it's a repetition almost just by putting the name. So one thing we could do to have access to this method, as an example, is we could go ahead and implement action listener as part of our GUI. Because it's an interface, it will not be counted as an inheritance. But action listener, we just got to make sure we select the correct one. But because it's an interface, all it is, it's a rule dictating that I must implement a method called action perform. So let's go ahead and say that. So as you could see, action perform is the same thing here. This is an anonymous object. It doesn't belong to any object. This one is the current GUI object. So we're taking care of when the button gets clicked. So now what we could do is, I'm just going to bring this one out for a second so we don't lose it. Actually, let's go ahead and put it in here for a second. We'll come back to it. So now, rather than saying new action listener over here, we could point it to the object that would have this method. And in this case, the object is the current object. So we could say this. And we could do the same thing for this one. Let me just copy whatever the inside was. Same thing for this guy. And let's go back to here. So now for all three objects, I could say this. Cool. Now, because they're kind of a repetitive code, well, there's nothing really being done here. This is perfectly fine, right? And in all three cases, let me just run it first. Let me just do run from here. In all three cases, it's going to pop out all of this stuff. So if I press submit, you'll see three things because I copied all three text values. But if I press the other two buttons, you'll see the same message being repeated multiple times, right? Is this good? Is this bad? Well, one thing, it cleaned up my class. We have access to this method. There's some good and there's some bad, and we'll talk about it more. But how can I distinguish now from one button click to the other button click? So let's come back to this submit name button. When, any of these, when they're clicked, action perform is executed, it's called, and an action event is given. This action event is what's going to allow us to determine which button got clicked. So if we do FE, that's the variable name here, FE dot, and what's important for us, there's a lot of things it gives us, but what's important for us is this get action command. Returns the command string associated with this action. So for example, single button might be toggled between show, let me bring this over here, show details or hide details, and so forth, so on. Okay, let's skip this. I'm going to explain what it is. So action command is a name that we give to our buttons. So when they get clicked, this action command name, this string, is also given to this method. So we could utilize it to differentiate from which button got clicked. So normally I would put this inside of a switch, say e.getActionCommand, and then we'll compare the three cases for what's going on. So this is good, but we need to give these action names over here at this level. So submit name, and we're gonna say set action command. There we go. And we got to give it something that's correct. I'm going to first do it wrong. I'm going to say submit name something. And we need to do the same thing for the left side button and the right side button. So over here, we're going to say left side button, set action command, left side button 1, let's say. And over here, we'll do it for number 2. Now, the problem, well, actually, this is okay, but you're going to see what the problem is. The problem is I put a value here, a string value, and later I need to get that value here. So I'm going to say case, in the case of it being a submit name something, do something, and we're going to break, right? And in the case of it being left side button 1, do something, and then break. Let me do Control Alt L to clean up. And in the last case of left side button 2, I forgot what it was called. Left side button 2. Do this specific thing, and then break. Now, the problem is, let's execute our application actually. It's going to be much easier to see the problem. I'm going to try and have everything on the screen. Now, when I click these buttons, you'll notice that none of them is doing anything. And the problem is, if you look here for a second, pause the video, try to figure out what is the problem. We set the action commands of all 3 buttons. The variable names are correct. And then we check those action commands. If it matches, do something. Can you see the problem? If not, pause the video, look at it. The problem is we created magic values that we eventually need to come back to, but I might make a typo or a mistake. So if you look at the submit name something, let's go ahead and copy that. Let's go ahead and copy it in green so it looks kind of the same thing. And let's type in that right here. Now, if you look at these 2 values, do you see any differences? Yes, the capital S, the lowercase s. Because I forgot that, I made a mistake. This is why variables are really useful. Magic values are okay sometimes when there's no need to come back to this enter name. But when it comes down to something that we need to compare later, or we need to have a unique value or something like that, it's wiser to make those as field variables that are a constant. So this over here, we could right click on it, refactor, and we could introduce a constant as a field or whatever you want, okay? Maybe there's one that extracts this to, let's try introduce constant. Submit name something. This, let's make it a bit better. Submit name button action command. It's long, but remember that when we come in over here to utilize it, we just need to type in 2 letters. And we get the IntelliSense popping up, and you press enter and everything's done for you, right? And the more you get familiar with utilizing a good IDE, the easier life will be while making clean and perfect code. So we're going to do the same thing for this one. Refactor, introduce constant. It's kind of good. Left side button 1, action command, right? The name is meaningful enough for me to understand what it is. And again, we're going to replace this one. So we make sure we don't make a mistake. And look again, 1 letter, the IntelliSense kind of figures out what I'm looking for and lets me press enter. So same thing for this one. Refactor, introduce constant. Left side button 2, action command. So I remember what this was for. And again, over here, we're going to replace this by doing capital L, and look what comes up. Now this time I have 2 of them, so they showcase both. It doesn't know better, but I press bottom arrow, down arrow, and press enter. Now if I run it, you'll notice that now the action commands are working correctly because I'm not making a stupid mistake, right? A typo mistake. And again, if you didn't understand what happened here, is we introduced a constant value at the top. In this case, it's constant because it's final, so we can never change the value. They made it static, but I don't need this to exist outside of our object being existing, so we could probably take off these static ones, right? We don't need it to exist outside of GUI. Mind you, if you get multiple GUI objects coming out nonstop, maybe static would be an ideal thing so that this variable doesn't get created for no reason. It's kind of up to you how you're going to choose that, and we'll get better at it as we go forward. Now, this action performed is making my method create components much cleaner. So now it's specific to just creating the stuff. And over here, action performed is going to take care of when the button gets clicked. And now if I'm given an action command that it doesn't recognize, well, we could do something like, in the case of something else, give an error here, blah, 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 and do something about it, okay? So normally you'll throw an exception here, throw an exception here. Why would we need this default? Well, this is the problem of having this action performed part of our class. Because it's public. And we can't just go ahead and make it private. We'll get an error because we're overriding a method. So because this is public, we're allowing outsiders outside this object to initiate this method, and they could have made sure that this action event could have been a fake one and put something in there and run one of these commands. So even though this allows us to create, to clean up our code a bit, it causes issues because the method is public. Having that anonymous class was actually a better deal because it hid this action performed under the hood. Okay? So for now, this is fine. In the next video, we'll talk more about this. See you then.